All right, we're going to look at another quilt in our series of How Do I Quilt the Quilt. This is another quilt from Debbie. It's 60.5 inches by 70, and it was a Moda sampler. There's another word in there I'm missing, but it was a Moda sampler quilt that she did, and the individual blocks are about 6 inches each one. So obviously your striped block is 6 inches. The blocks are more traditional. You even have a couple of applique in here. This one's applique, I believe, is a bird, and then I know I saw a flower. There's your flower there. And the quilt's actually upside down, but that won't matter to us. So this quilt is actually somewhat difficult to come up with on the quilting. Why? Because there's so much color in the blocks, very colorful yet classic, and we have stripes dealing in between those with more color as well. So to make that quilt and the quilting stand out, it could be somewhat of a challenge. What can we do? We can consider the stripe blocks background blocks and quilt them like we would background blocks, or we can put designs within them. We could stitch wreaths around these blocks and just do a generic wreath of any sort. We could do one with a feather, or we could do it with, leaves coming out, things like that. I don't care to do that because it takes away from the block. We could come in with simple loops and maybe work with other designs here and there. We could do the hook in that quilt. But again, we do nothing to really make those blocks shine. So what can we do to accomplish attractiveness within the stripes and yet give the blocks that we put all of our effort into do justice? Well, let's look at some options. So I mentioned that we could consider the background, that the stripes as background. So we could do your larger hooks and curls in the background. I would not make them super small. The idea is not to make a heavily quilted quilt unless you choose to do that. The idea is to create it just as a background, fill it in with something. So your hooks and swirls, or anything that you would come up with comparable, is one idea. You could also use some ruler work. I really don't care for that. I use my ruler work purposefully when there's really some designs I can get. And I'm not happy with a whole lot on this because, again, we're competing against those stripes. So I tried some different straight line things. I tried some curved crosshatch. I would probably be more happier with a circle wreath than that. If I was going to do something like that. I tried to come up with some different designs. Wasn't really happy with anything. So ruler work is an option. I would consider more the background stitching. And then you've gotten a peek at a few other things. Well, I'll just show them to you. Would be obviously to put feathers or something similar. Put feathers. You could do that in your background. I've gone through a lot of feathers and explained them, and with some good doodling, that's a possibility even if you're not ready for those now. I also like a very minimal design. This is just simply coming down in a big curl, going over in another curl, and then ending in a curl. You could add one here too if you wanted, but making it very simple. I really like that because you're making that whole quilt simple in that area, and that will help make your block shine. Before I go into that border, which you're seeing, let's then talk about the blocks. I would suggest, so that we can give justice to the blocks, that you keep the blocks simple. Work with teardrops, work with simple quilting, and work with continuous lines around the seams. So I showed something similar to this and it's in a video on YouTube where I just did continuous stitching around the seams, and in some of these corners you can throw in a teardrop. Before I even talk about that, I've had to retape this a couple of times, so I've forgotten what I've said and what. Let me go back. If I'm not going to do an all-over quilting on the job on this, which is I would not, I would work within the blocks. Before I start, I would stitch in the ditch in all of the main blocks. They're 6 inches. So, and this can go quickly, and then both ways, of course. When I'm done with that, then I would go ahead at that point and stitch around the inner part on this side of the flying geese. Don't do this outer part yet. I'll talk to you about that. At that point, you have stitch in the ditch on all of the blocks. They're secure, and then you have it around that main section that secures those blocks entirely. Now let's go back again and continue talking about those individual blocks. So I showed you one where it had stitching in the seam, around the seams. Here we've talked about the E's. We're going to talk about L's and some other things on Friday, but I'm just choosing the solid colors to work in of the blocks. I could come out on the outer side, but because these are only 6 inches, this could be enough. We could then come in and maybe these all have some color. So I might choose to stitch in the ditch within that 9 patch, I think. Well, I forget what that block is called, but it is a 9 patch type. And then on the solid colors, I could do owls, and they're just a longer version of the E's. And we'll talk about that on Friday. We could also, here's a little bit, this is a textured solid, but it has that feel of solid. You could come with some of that. Here I've got L's, here I've got L's and E's, and here I have a little bit of cross hatching that you could do on that side and this side, just a little bit in each block. You could also stitch in the ditches if you prefer. Here I came over, and on this one we've gone through this example before, and I just came up and down with a leaf type of shape in each of the horizontal and vertical and diagonal areas. So that's an option too within the blocks. So I would keep the blocks simple and work with that type of a style. If you've got applique on it, I would simply stitch real tightly around the applique, and then if you want to add anything else, you could do that. I mean, this here again could be the L's or E's, or it could be some of this. See, even if you're beginning, you can do some of these designs, and you could just come maybe do the totally opposite one as well, just a little bit, to where, and we could even come here. It's just a little bit, but it would add attractiveness to that block, and then go on to the next one. On this one, you could still do the same continuous curves. Here, we'll look at this. We could even come here, do a teardrop, do that continuous curve, and then do it on, whoops, excuse me. I kind of messed that one up. Then do it as well on the rectangle. We could do the outside or skip it, and then we could come across and do it again and continue on all the way around this block. And I'm just going to show you how attractive that can be when you do the whole thing. And look, we're getting a fun little shape here that is actually lovely. Whoops, I didn't do that part. There we go. Sometimes you get moving fast. There we go. Isn't that cute? And then you could come in here if you wanted to and do just something simple like that right inside of it. So I would suggest that you would keep the blocks simple, the blocks themselves simple, and then work with either feathers coming down or a simple, you could do the background curl or just something simple where you're coming down, curling back around, and then down at the bottom and continue. I really like this. Again, I've taped this up a couple of times, so I can't remember if I've shown you, but I really like this. It's simple and it doesn't compete with the blocks so much. So I've just made a little variation of that, that curl. So stitching in the ditch, keeping your blocks simple, and then coming up with something like the curls or a feather or anything on that order. Now, when I get to this outside, then the whole thing changes, because doing feathers on just the one portion may not look as good, and doing curls in half of it may not as well. So I would keep those to this area, and then I would surround the outer setting triangles with something different. Now I've given you a couple of options here with teardrops and feathers, and here's another one. I'll tell you what my favorite is, and it always is. It's just that half of a curve for a spine, and then the feathers coming. I start back here on that. I come down over here and I end with a little teardrop. Then I come back up and then I start doing my feathers around that. And that way when you get down to the bottom, that teardrop's there. Or you can choose to bring the spine only down to about here and then come back up, do your feathers, and end at the very end with a teardrop. But with that design all the way around your quilt, that really looks good. Now you could also come in and do something simple like a swirl if that's easier for you. You can make your main design the swirl and keep it simple like that as well, and carry that out all the way around your quilt. But you would be changing how that is, and it would be obvious that your design in this outer section is completely different, and I would keep it different. So that would cover the whole inner section. Then you can choose. I would consider stitching in the ditch around every flying goose. So coming around and stitching in each one and then up to the next one. So the stitching would go something like this. Now you could break it up and do each side different like this and go that way and then work your way back down like this. That's one way to do it. You could also do a whole triangle, go up to the next one, do a whole triangle, up to the next one, a whole triangle, whatever you like. But this would look very nice and very finished by stitching in the ditch of each triangle. With that line tamer ruler, you got it. You got it set, no problem. Then I would go ahead and do go all the way around this. I know it's possible you would have done that when you did your triangles, and if you feel that you've got a good solid line stitched in the ditch, then you're good. But just because I really want it to look nice, I personally like to take one more lap all the way around that outer just by itself so it's all stitched in the ditch. Now what do I do with that outside portion? Well, there's a couple of ideas. Again, I really like that curl. This is 6 inches, so this might be a little bit big for that, but you could play with that. Use your plexiglass and see what you can come up with that. Again, I like keeping this quilt simple. I really do. It keeps it from looking too busy, so I like using these big curls in it. Here's an option though, and I've shown you this before. Another option would to be to do your serpentine spine or line for your feathers and go up probably no closer than a half of an inch to the top or the bottom, somewhere around there. You just want to make sure that you're not going to run this out beyond your binding. And then go ahead and come around with a curl and a few feathers down to a curl on the bottom, come back and a few feathers, and repeat that process. When I get around to the corner, I go ahead and do one around the corner, and then on the top you can also just do a simple curl, or vice versa. If you're at the top at the time, you can do the reverse, your curl and feathers and a curl down right in the corner. I just quickly drew this out. So I love putting these together with this border, with the simple border and the curl and the feathers. And then I do like either one, either the feather or just a simple curl all the way around that. You could work on what you like for that, but that would be simple and it would be nice in there. And then keeping your blocks simple. So I've kind of gone over some things. This was difficult to talk through, but hopefully you got the feel for how you might still make this quilt attractive by keeping your quilting in the striped areas a little bit more simple, as well as in the blocks, but yet highlighting the blocks themselves. And then keeping the borders simple but very attractive. So I hope that was helpful today. It was a long one. Have a good time quilting.